Millionaire marries. Overweight woman for a bet and despairs when he discovers what she hides. The crystal glasses clinked as Alexander Rhodes and his longtime friend James Wellington celebrated another successful merger at the exclusive Skyline Club in Manhattan. The deal had added another billion to Alexander's already substantial fortune, but the 35-year-old CEO appeared unusually restless, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with a bored expression. "I don't understand why you're not more excited, Alex," James remarked, leaning back in his leather chair. "This is your biggest acquisition yet." Alexander's steel-gray eyes surveyed the glittering New York skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "It's all becoming rather predictable, isn't it? The negotiations, the contracts, the celebrations. Even the women." He gestured toward a group of supermodel-type ladies who had been stealing glances at their table all evening. James studied his friend's face carefully. In the 15 years since their Harvard days, he'd watched Alexander build his empire with ruthless determination. Every aspect of his life was meticulously curated, from his penthouse apartment to his rotating cast of gorgeous girlfriends, none lasting more than 3 months. "Perhaps you need a different kind of challenge," James suggested, a mysterious glint in his eye. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" "A wager." James pulled out his phone and pulled up a photo. "This is my wife's cousin, Olivia Chen. She works as a librarian and runs a small book club for underprivileged kids. She's brilliant, kind, and completely unlike anyone you've ever dated." Alexander glanced at the photo of a plus-size Asian woman with glasses and simple clothes. She was smiling warmly at the camera while surrounded by children holding books. "Not my type," he said dismissively. "Exactly," James replied. "Which is why I'm willing to bet $10 million that you couldn't marry her and stay married for 1 full year." Alexander nearly choked on his drink. "Are you serious?" "Completely. 10 million if you can convince her to marry you and maintain the marriage for 12 months. You can't tell her about the bet, and you have to treat her with respect. If you fail or break these conditions, you pay me the 10 million instead." Alexander studied the photo again, his business mind already calculating the risk versus the money wasn't the issue. He could lose 10 million without blinking, but the challenge, it would certainly be different from... "She'd never agree to marry me," he said, but James could hear the interest in his voice. "You'd be surprised. Olivia's practical-minded, and she's been looking for a way to expand her children's literacy program. A wealthy husband might seem like a reasonable solution." Alexander's fingers drummed against the table as he considered the proposition. 1 year of marriage to someone like her. "It seems impossible." "Afraid you can't do it," James goaded, knowing exactly how to push his friend's buttons. Alexander's jaw tightened. If there was one thing he couldn't resist, it was being told something was beyond his capabilities. "Fine," he said finally, extending his hand. "You have a deal." James shook it firmly, hiding his smile. "I'll arrange an introduction through my wife. Remember, treat her with respect, no mention of the bet, and 1 full year." As they returned to their drinks, Alexander found himself returning to the photo. Olivia Chen was the opposite of everything he found attractive. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, her figure far from the runway model type he preferred, and her lifestyle completely removed from his world of high finance and luxury. Yet there was something in her smile that caught his attention, a genuineness he rarely encountered in his social circle. This would be a challenge unlike any he'd faced before, but Alexander Rhodes didn't become a billionaire by backing down from challenges. Little did he know that this wager would set in motion events that would transform not just his life, but his very understanding of value, love, and redemption. As he sat there planning his strategy, he had no idea that Olivia Chen had secrets of her own, secrets that would turn his carefully orchestrated game completely upside down. James watched his friend's calculating expression and felt a twinge of guilt. He knew things about Olivia that he wasn't sharing, but perhaps that was for the best. Sometimes the most important lessons came from unexpected places, and Alexander Rhodes was long overdue for several life-changing revelations. The Wilson Public Library wasn't the kind of place Alexander Rhodes typically frequented. The worn brick building in Queens stood in stark contrast to the gleaming skyscrapers of his usual domain. Yet here he was, dressed in a carefully casual outfit that still probably cost more than most library employees made in a month. He spotted her immediately. Olivia Chen sat at a round table surrounded by children, her animated voice bringing a story to life. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her clothes were practical, a flowing floral dress that didn't hide her plus-size figure. She wore minimal makeup, and her glasses kept sliding down her nose as she gestured enthusiastically. And then, she was saying, the little prince realized that what made his rose special wasn't its appearance, but the time he had devoted to it. Her voice carried a warmth that had even the most fidgety children entranced. Alexander found himself listening despite himself. There was something compelling about her presence, a genuine passion that he rarely encountered in his world of practiced speeches and rehearsed sincerity. When the reading session ended, James's wife Sophie made the introduction as planned. "Olivia, this is Alexander Rhodes, the friend I was telling you about. He's interested in supporting literacy programs." Olivia's warm smile faltered slightly as she met Alexander's gaze, and he caught a flicker of something, recognition, disapproval, before her professional demeanor returned. "Mr. Rhodes, what a surprise to see someone from the corporate world showing interest in our humble program." There was an edge to her voice that intrigued him. Most women he met were either obviously impressed by his wealth or trying too hard to pretend they weren't. Olivia's reaction was different, almost as if she were challenging him. "Please call me Alexander," he said, turning on the charm that had won over countless boardrooms. "I've been thinking about expanding my philanthropic efforts, and Sophie speaks very highly of your work here." "Does she?" Olivia began gathering books from the table. "And what exactly interests you about children's literacy, Mr. Rhodes? The tax write-offs or the PR opportunities?" Sophie looked mortified, but Alexander found himself fighting back a smile. This was not going according to his carefully prepared script, and for once, that was interesting. "Actually," he improvised, "I was hoping you could educate me about the real impact of programs like yours. Perhaps over dinner." Olivia paused, studying him with those intelligent dark eyes. "I don't mix business with pleasure, Mr. Rhodes." "Then let's call it strictly business," he countered.
"You can tell me about your program's needs, and I'll listen without any expectations. Just dinner and conversation." She seemed to consider this for a moment, and Alexander found himself genuinely curious about what she was thinking. Her face was more expressive than he was used to, none of the practiced poses he encountered in his social circle. "Friday at 7, she said finally.
"But I choose the restaurant. There's a small Vietnamese place on 74th Street that actually needs the business, unlike those overpriced establishments you probably prefer." Alexander accepted, hiding his surprise. Women usually jumped at the chance to be seen at exclusive restaurants with him. But then, everything about Olivia Chen seemed designed to upend his expectations. After she left, Sophie turned to him with concern. "Alexander, be careful with her. Olivia's been through a lot, and she's not as naive as you might think." "What do you mean?" "Just, she's different from your usual type, and not just in the obvious ways. Don't underestimate her." As Alexander walked back to his waiting car, he found himself replaying the interaction. Olivia's slight hesitation when they met, that edge in her voice. There was more going on than a simple library program director meeting a potential donor. In his office later that day, he instructed his assistant to compile information about Olivia Chen. It was standard practice before any business dealing, he told himself, ignoring the fact that this was supposed to be a simple dinner. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, Olivia was sitting in her small apartment, looking at an old photograph of her father standing proudly in front of his store. "I won't let you down, Dad," she whispered, her fingers tracing the sign that read, "Chen's Family Market." Sometimes justice takes unexpected paths. The game they were both playing was far more complex than either realized, and the stakes were higher than mere millions. As Friday approached, both Alexander and Olivia prepared for battle, each believing they held the upper hand, neither understanding that fate had plans of its own. Fothan's neon sign flickered in the evening drizzle as Alexander Rhodes stepped out of his Bentley, drawing curious glances from passers-by. The small Vietnamese restaurant, with its weathered awning and slightly foggy windows, was a far cry from the Michelin-starred establishments he frequented. Yet something about its unpretentious authenticity made him pause and reconsider his initial judgment. Inside, Olivia was already seated at a corner table, wearing a simple navy blue dress that seemed to soften her features. She looked up from her menu and raised an eyebrow at his obvious discomfort with the humble surroundings. "Too different from your usual five-star experiences, Mr. Rhodes?" she asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Alexander," he corrected, settling into the surprisingly comfortable wooden chair. "And I appreciate authentic experiences. This place has character." "It has more than that," Olivia replied, nodding toward the elderly couple working behind the counter. "Mr. and Mrs. Than have owned this restaurant for 30 years. They put both their children through college serving the best pho in Queens. But lately, they've been struggling since a big restaurant chain opened nearby." Alexander recognized the pointed commentary in her words. It was the kind of situation his company often created. Big businesses displacing smaller ones in the name of progress and profit. Yet something in her tone made him want to defend himself. "Progress is inevitable," he said, studying the menu. "The market evolves, and businesses must adapt, or what?" Olivia interrupted, her dark eyes flashing. "Or get crushed by corporations that care more about profit margins than community impact. Tell me, Mr. Rhodes, have you ever watched a family lose everything they've built over decades?" The intensity of her question caught him off guard. Before he could respond, Mrs. Than approached their table with a warm smile, diffusing the tension. As she took their orders, Alexander noticed how Olivia spoke to her in perfect Vietnamese, making the older woman laugh delightedly. "You speak Vietnamese?" he asked after Mrs. Than left, genuinely impressed. "I grew up in a neighborhood like this one," Olivia replied, her expression softening slightly. "My father believed in knowing the stories behind every store, every restaurant. He said community wasn't just about business, it was about people. And what does your father think about your work now?" A shadow crossed her face. "He's not around anymore, but his lessons stay with me." The food arrived, steaming bowls of pho that filled the air with aromatic spices. Alexander watched as Olivia demonstrated the proper way to eat it, mixing herbs and sauces with practiced ease. Despite himself, he found the meal more enjoyable than many of his recent dining experiences at exclusive restaurants. "So," Olivia said, after they'd eaten in surprisingly comfortable silence, "why are you really interested in our literacy program?" Alexander had prepared a perfect answer, carefully crafted to appeal to someone like her. Instead, he found himself saying, "Honestly, everything in my life has become predictable. The same deals, the same people, the same conversations. Your program, it's different. Different because it doesn't fit into your usual world of high finance and beautiful people?" Her tone was sharp, but there was something else there. Curiosity, perhaps. "Different because it matters," he replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. "I saw how those kids looked at you during story time. That kind of impact. You can't put a price on it." Olivia studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decode the truth behind his words. "No," she said finally, "you can't. But some things do have a price, don't they? Everything can be bought and sold in your world." The conversation shifted to her program's needs, but Alexander found himself distracted by the layers of meaning in her previous statement. There was history there, pain perhaps, carefully hidden behind her professional demeanor. As the evening drew to a close, they stood outside the restaurant, watching the city lights reflect off the wet pavement. "Thank you for dinner," Alexander said, genuinely meaning it. This was enlightening. "Was it what you expected?" Olivia asked, pulling her coat tighter against the cool evening air. "Nothing about you is what I expected," he admitted. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Good. Maybe there's hope for you yet, Mr. Rhodes." She turned to leave, then paused. "Same time next week? There's another family restaurant you should experience." Alexander found himself agreeing before he could analyze why. As he watched her walk away, he realized this game he'd started was becoming far more complicated than he'd anticipated. The women he usually dated were like perfectly staged photographs, beautiful but predictable. Olivia Chen was more like a novel, each page revealing unexpected depths. In his car, he checked his phone to find a message from James. How did it go? Alexander stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. The evening had left him with more questions than answers, and a nagging feeling that he was missing something crucial about Olivia Chen. The $10 million bet suddenly seemed secondary to solving the mystery she presented. What he didn't know was that Olivia was in her apartment, making a phone call of her own. "Phase 1 is proceeding as planned," she said softly, looking at the old family photograph on her desk. He has no idea. Over the next few weeks, Alexander found himself drawn into Olivia's world in ways he never expected. Their weekly business dinners had become a strange highlight in his carefully scheduled life, each one at a different family-owned restaurant with its own story to tell. Tonight, they sat in a small Greek taverna, the sound of bouzouki music mixing with animated conversations in multiple languages. Alexander watched as Olivia chatted with the owner's daughter about her college applications, offering advice about scholarship opportunities she'd researched. "You do this everywhere we go," he observed after the girl left their table. "Build connections, offer help, remember details about people's lives." Olivia broke off a piece of warm pita bread. "That's how communities work, Alexander. Something your corporate takeover manuals probably don't cover." He noticed she'd finally started using his first name, though her tone still carried that edge of challenge he'd come to expect. "You know, not all corporate expansions are about destruction. Sometimes they bring opportunities, jobs, development. Like the development project in Flushing 3 years ago?" Olivia interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. "The one where dozens of family businesses were forced out because they couldn't afford the new rent prices?" Alexander frowned. He remembered that project. It had been one of his earlier successes. "How do you know about that?" "Research," she replied smoothly. But he caught a flicker of something in her eyes. "It's what I do before considering potential donors for our program." Before he could press further, his phone buzzed with a message from James. "How's the bet going? 2 months down, 10 to go." Alexander felt an unexpected surge of guilt as he quickly tucked the phone away. The bet had become increasingly uncomfortable to think about, especially as he found himself genuinely enjoying these evenings with Olivia. "Another urgent business matter?" she asked, and he detected a hint of bitterness in her tone. "No, just James checking in." He hesitated, then added, "He's worried I'm monopolizing his wife's favorite cousin." "Funny," Olivia said, studying him over her glass of wine. "I wouldn't have thought I'd be your type at all. I'm beginning to think I didn't know my type as well as I thought I did." The words came out before he could stop them, surprisingly sincere. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the usual barriers between them seemed to waver. Then Olivia looked away, her fingers nervously adjusting her glasses. "Tell me about your father," Alexander said suddenly, seizing the moment of vulnerability. "You mention him sometimes, but never directly." Olivia was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but controlled. "My father believed in the American dream. He came here with nothing, worked 3 jobs to save money, and finally opened his own business. It was a small market, nothing fancy, but it was everything to him, to our family." "What happened to it?" "Progress happened," she said, the word bitter on her tongue. "Development. Corporate expansion. All those pretty words that mean the same thing. The big fish eating the little fish." She took a deep breath, composing herself. "But that's all in the past now." Alexander felt a strange discomfort in his chest. How many small businesses had he displaced over the years without a second thought? How many families had stories like Olivia's? "Your literacy program," he said carefully. "It's about more than just reading, isn't it?" A small smile played at her lips. "Everything is about more than what it seems, Alexander. Even people." She glanced at her watch. "I should go. I have an early meeting tomorrow with potential sponsors for our summer program." As they walked out into the cool evening air, Alexander made a decision. "Let me sponsor the summer program. Whatever you need." Olivia stopped and turned to face him. "Why?" "Because—" He struggled to find the right words. "Because I'm starting to understand what you mean about impact and community. And maybe it's time I made a different kind of impact." She studied his face intently, as if searching for something. "Careful, Mr. Rhodes. You're starting to sound like someone who cares about more than just profit margins. Would that be so terrible? No, she said softly, but it might be dangerous. Before he could ask what she meant, she added, "Pick me up tomorrow at 7. There's a place in Brooklyn you need to see." As he watched her walk away, Alexander realized two things. First, he was falling for Olivia Chen in a way that had nothing to do with any bet. And second, she was hiding something connected to his past business dealings that could change everything. In her apartment, Olivia pulled out an old business card from her father's market. On the back was a faded note. "Remember, little one, sometimes justice comes in unexpected packages." She traced her father's handwriting with a trembling finger, wondering if she was still serving justice, or if her heart was leading her down a different path entirely. The Brooklyn neighborhood Olivia directed them to looked strangely familiar to Alexander. As his Bentley crawled down the quiet street lined with shuttered storefronts, a nagging sense of recognition tugged at his memory. Then he saw it, the faded outline of a sign on one of the buildings. Chen's Family Market. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as realization dawned. This was one of his earliest development projects, the one that had established his reputation as a ruthless but effective businessman. He glanced at Olivia, but her face was turned toward the window, unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Why are we here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Park there," she said, pointing to a spot in front of the empty storefront. As they stepped out of the car, she finally turned to face him. "This is where my story began, and where it changed forever." Alexander stared at the building, seeing it with new eyes. The windows were boarded up, but traces of the life that once filled it remained. The faded awning, the ghost of lettering on the glass, the worn steps where countless customers had once entered and exited. "Your father's store," he said, the weight of understanding settling heavily on his shoulders. "My father's dream," Olivia corrected, moving closer to the building. "He used to let neighborhood kids read comic books here after school if they finished their homework. He kept a little reading corner with beanbag chairs and a shelf of books. That's where I first fell in love with stories." Her voice caught slightly. "That's where I decided to become a librarian." Alexander felt sick. How many times had he driven past this building without a second thought? How many lives had his business decisions affected in ways he'd never considered? "Olivia, don't apologize," she cut him off sharply. "Not yet. Not until you understand everything." She pulled out an old photograph from her purse and handed it to him. It showed a younger version of herself, with a smiling middle-aged man in front of the store on what appeared to be its opening day. "My father took out loans to keep the store running when the neighborhood started changing. When the eviction notice came, he tried to fight it. He believed in the system, in fairness, in the American dream." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He didn't understand that dreams mean nothing to corporate spreadsheets." Alexander stared at the photo, at the pride and hope in both their faces. What happened to him? He lost everything. The store, his savings, his health. She took a shuddering breath. The community tried to help, but everyone was struggling. Mr. Than from the Vietnamese restaurant offered him a job. The Greek taverna owner brought food. But my father, he couldn't bear the charity. His pride was all he had left. She turned to face Alexander fully, and in the streetlight, he could see tears gleaming in her eyes. "Do you know what the cruelest part was? No one from your company ever came to see what they were destroying. It was all just numbers on paper to you." Alexander felt the carefully constructed walls of his worldview crumbling. Every business deal, every acquisition, every successful development. How many similar stories lay buried beneath them? "The literacy program," he said slowly. "It's your way of continuing what your father started here." A small smile touched her lips. "Books saved me after we lost everything. They gave me purpose, hope, a way forward. I wanted to give that same gift to other children who might be facing their own struggles." Without thinking, Alexander reached out and took her hand. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. "Show me," he said softly. "Show me how to make this right." Olivia looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him. "Why should I believe you've changed? This could all be another business strategy." Because for the first time in my life, I'm seeing the real cost of success, he replied honestly. And I'm not sure I can live with it anymore. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of history and possibility hanging between them. Then Olivia squeezed his hand gently before letting go. There's an empty building near the library, she said finally. It would be perfect for an expanded community center. Books, tutoring, job training, small business support. But it needs significant renovation. Consider it done, Alexander responded immediately. No, Olivia shook her head. I don't want your money, Alexander. I want your involvement, your time, your understanding. If you're serious about change, prove it. As they stood there in the growing darkness, Alexander realized this was a turning point. The bet with James seemed trivial now, almost offensive in light of what he'd learned. This was about something far more important: redemption, justice, and perhaps, though neither of them was ready to admit it yet, love. What he didn't know was that Olivia was fighting her own battle. Between the desire for justice she'd carried for years and the growing realization that the man standing before her was no longer the heartless businessman who had destroyed her father's dream. They drove back in contemplative silence, both lost in thoughts of the past and possibilities for the future. Neither noticed James watching from across the street, a worried expression on his face as he witnessed the unfolding of something he hadn't anticipated when he proposed the bet. The conference room at Rhodes Enterprises fell silent as Alexander finished his presentation. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly struggling to process what they'd just heard. Let me get this straight. Harold Matthews, the eldest board member, leaned forward. You want to allocate $50 million to create a small business protection fund and transform our recently acquired properties into affordable commercial spaces for local businesses? With comprehensive support programs for existing tenants, Alexander added firmly, clicking to the next slide. The screen showed pictures of various small businesses, including the Vietnamese restaurant and Greek taverna. These establishments aren't just businesses, they're the backbone of their communities. This is unprecedented, another board member commented, frowning at the numbers. The potential profit loss will be offset by community goodwill and sustainable long-term growth, Alexander interrupted. We've been measuring success purely in dollars, but there are other metrics we need to consider. As he continued outlining his plan, Alexander caught his reflection in the window. Tailored suit, confident stance, but something fundamentally different in his eyes. 3 months ago, he wouldn't have recognized this version of himself. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia sat in her tiny office at the library, staring at her phone. The screen showed a draft message to her cousin Sophie. I can't go through with this. He's not who I thought he was. Her finger hovered over the send button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Instead, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out another photograph, this one showing her father in his hospital bed, taken just weeks before. She stopped the thought there. A knock at her door made her quickly tuck the photo away. Come in. Mrs. Than entered, carrying a container of pho. You missed lunch again, dear. Too busy with your new project? Olivia managed a smile. The community center plans are taking more time than expected. She didn't mention that most of that time involved long evening discussions with Alexander, planning and dreaming bigger than she'd ever dared before. Ah, yes, your businessman, Mrs. Than said with knowing eyes. He came to the restaurant yesterday, you know. Alone. Olivia looked up, surprised. Alexander was there? Asked many questions about small business loans, lease agreements. Wanted to know our story. Mrs. Than smiled. He listened well, different from before, when his kind only saw papers and numbers. Before Olivia could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. Board meeting finished. They approved everything. Can we meet? There's something important I need to tell you. Her heart skipped a beat, though she wasn't sure if it was from anxiety or anticipation. The lines between her original plan for justice and her growing feelings for Alexander were becoming dangerously blurred. You care for him, Mrs. Than observed quietly. It's complicated, Olivia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Love always is. The older woman placed the food on her desk. But hate makes a poor foundation for happiness, dear. Remember that. After Mrs. Than left, Olivia found herself walking to the children's section of the library. The reading corner Alexander had helped her set up last week was filled with kids, some reading alone, others being tutored by volunteers from his company's new community outreach program. She watched as a young girl struggled with a word, her face scrunched in concentration. Corporation? The child sounded out carefully. Olivia remembered herself at that age, sitting in her father's store, learning words that would later take on such painful significance. Her phone buzzed again. James this time. We need to talk about Alexander. Things are getting out of hand. Olivia closed her eyes, the weight of her secrets pressing down on her. She had started this with a clear purpose. Make Alexander Rhodes fall in love with her, then reveal how his actions had destroyed her family, rejecting him publicly when the truth about the bet came out. A perfect plan for justice. But she hadn't counted on him actually changing, hadn't expected him to spend hours with the children in her program, teaching them about business and dreams, hadn't anticipated him using his influence to protect rather than destroy. And she certainly hadn't planned on falling in love with him. The sound of children's laughter brought her back to the present. She looked around the reading corner, at the new books, the comfortable chairs, the wall mural depicting a world of possibilities. All of it existed because Alexander Rhodes had become someone different from the man who had unknowingly shattered her world years ago. Meet me at Chen's Market in an hour, she texted back to him. It was time to face the truth. All of it. She just prayed that when the dust settled, there would be something left worth salvaging. What she didn't know was that Alexander was already there, standing in front of her father's old store, holding a set of keys and architectural plans that would change everything once again. The setting sun cast long shadows across the empty street as Olivia approached Chen's Market. Her steps slowed when she saw Alexander standing there, his usual confident posture replaced by something more tentative. He was holding a thick roll of papers, and even from a distance, she could sense his nervous energy. I thought we could use your father's store as our model, he said without preamble, unrolling the architectural plans across the hood of his car. Look, we'll restore the original facade, but modernize the interior. A market on the ground floor, community space upstairs for classes and meetings. The reading corner would be right here, twice the size of the original. Olivia stared at the detailed drawings, her throat tight. What are you saying? I bought the building. Alexander's words came out in a rush. Not just this one, the whole block. But instead of tearing everything down, we're going to bring it back to life. Small business incubators, affordable commercial spaces, support programs. He paused, watching her face carefully. Starting with Chen's Market. Olivia's hand trembled as she traced the familiar storefront in the drawings. Everything she'd planned, all her carefully orchestrated revenge, was crumbling in the face of this unexpected gesture. Why? She whispered. Because I love you. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. And because I need to make this right. Not just for you, but for everyone like your father, who had their dreams crushed by people like the man I used to be. Tears spilled down Olivia's cheeks. You don't understand. You can't love me. This wasn't supposed to happen. Alexander stepped closer, confusion and concern etched on his face. What do you mean? I knew. The words felt like glass in her throat. I knew exactly who you were when we met. About the bet with James, about everything. I wanted you to fall in love with me so I could reject you, make you feel a fraction of the pain you caused my family. She expected him to recoil, to show anger or betrayal. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his expression softening with understanding. I know, he said quietly. Olivia's head snapped up. What? James told me last week. He felt guilty about the whole thing. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of vulnerability. I've known for days, but it didn't change anything. If anything, it made me respect you more. Respect me? For planning to hurt you? For fighting for justice? For standing up to someone who hurt your family? For being strong enough to try to make a difference? He gestured at the library across town. Everything you've built, every child you've helped, it all came from that pain, that drive to make things better. How could I not fall in love with someone like that? Olivia felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. I was supposed to hate you, and I was supposed to marry you for a bet. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. But sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes people change. Sometimes justice looks different than we imagined. My father would be proud of you, Alexander finished. Not for seeking revenge, but for turning pain into purpose. For creating something beautiful from something broken. He touched her cheek gently, wiping away a tear. Help me do the same. Not because of guilt or obligation, but because together we could make real change. Olivia looked at the architectural plans again, seeing not just the restored building, but the possibility of healing. For the community, for her father's legacy, for herself. The bet, she said suddenly. What about James and the 10 million? Alexander laughed softly. I already told him to donate it to the community center. Seemed fitting, somehow. You're not the man I thought you were, Olivia whispered. No, he agreed. I'm the man you helped me become. She reached for the plans with trembling fingers, her other hand finding his. As they stood there in the growing darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and possibilities of the future, both realized that true justice sometimes comes not from revenge, but from redemption. What they didn't see was Sophie watching from her car across the street, smiling through her own tears as she deleted the message she'd been about to send to both of them. Some stories, she decided, needed to find their own endings. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Chen's Market had become the center of a transformation that was capturing the attention of the entire neighborhood. The construction crew worked diligently, but what made the process remarkable was the community's involvement. Alexander had insisted on hiring local workers and consulting with neighborhood residents about every decision. One sunny morning, Olivia stood in what would soon be the new reading corner, surrounded by dust and possibility. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed windows, creating patterns on the floor where her father's old checkout counter had once stood. Mrs. Lee suggested we add a coffee corner here, Alexander said, walking in with 2 cups from the local cafe. He handed one to Olivia. She thinks it would encourage parents to stay while their kids browse books. Dad would have loved that, Olivia replied, accepting the coffee. He always said business was about creating spaces where people wanted to linger. Alexander wrapped an arm around her waist, and she leaned into him naturally, a gesture that still surprised them both with its ease. Speaking of lingering, he said, the contractor needs to know about the apartment upstairs. What about it? Well, he hesitated, then plunged ahead. I was thinking it could be perfect for the market's new owners to live above the store, just like your family used to. Olivia turned to face him. New owners. If they're interested. Alexander pulled out a document from his briefcase. I've had my lawyers draw up the papers. The market, the apartment, everything. It would be yours, Olivia, to run however you see fit. She stared at him, coffee forgotten in her hand. Alexander, I can't. You can, he interrupted gently. This isn't charity or guilt. It's investment in the community. In us. He gestured around the space. You know better than anyone what this place needs to be. And watching you these past weeks, working with the construction teams, planning the layout, consulting with neighbors. This is your dream too, isn't it? Olivia looked around the space, at the walls that would soon hold shelves of books and fresh produce, at the corner where children would gather for story time, at the large windows that would let the whole neighborhood see the revival of a community landmark. It's not just about the market anymore, she said slowly. It's about showing that change is possible, that communities can heal, that people can change, Alexander added softly. She touched his face gently. You really have, you know, changed, because you showed me what really matters. He covered her hand with his. The board meets next week to review the Community Investment Initiative. I want you there, not just as my girlfriend, but as a partner in this project. Your experience, your understanding of what communities need, it's invaluable. Olivia laughed. Never thought I'd be advising Rhodes Enterprises on community development. Life has a way of surprising us. Alexander smiled. Like falling in love with someone who was planning to break your heart. Or falling in love with someone you were supposed to hate, she countered, then grew serious. What will the board think? About us? About all of this? They're already seeing the results. The positive press, the community support, the potential for sustainable growth. He gestured out the window where several neighboring businesses were also undergoing renovation. This isn't just good ethics, it's good business. Different from what we used to do, but better. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was James and Sophie, carrying what looked like old photographs. Found these in my parents' attic, Sophie said, handing them to Olivia. Thought they might help with getting the details right for the restoration. Olivia gasped as she flipped through the photos. The market on its opening day, her father proudly standing beneath the sign, the original layout of the store. These are perfect, she whispered. Consider it my way of making amends, James said, looking slightly uncomfortable. That bet, I never thought it would lead to all this. Sometimes the worst decisions lead us to the best places, Alexander replied, squeezing Olivia's hand. As they showed James and Sophie around the construction site, pointing out where everything would go, Olivia felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since her father's store first closed. This wasn't just about restoring a building, it was about building something new from the foundations of the past. Later, as they locked up for the day, Alexander pulled out a small box. One more thing, he said nervously. No bets, no ulterior motives, just us. He opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. Marry me, Olivia. Not for a year, but for life. Let's build this future together. In the fading light of day, standing in the space that represented both her past and future, Olivia looked at the man who had transformed from her enemy into her partner, and knew there was only one possible answer. The news of their engagement spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By morning, Mrs. Tha had already prepared a celebratory feast. The Greek taverna owner had ordered special wine from his homeland, and the local bakery was sketching designs for a wedding cake that would reflect their story, as the enthusiastic owner put it. Olivia sat in what was quickly becoming her favorite spot, the nearly finished reading corner of the new Chen's market. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the fresh paint and new bookshelves. Her father's old business ledger lay open in her lap, its pages filled with his meticulous handwriting. I said yes, Dad, she whispered, touching the worn pages. But not just to Alexander. Yes to healing. Yes to change. Yes to building something new from what was broken. Talking to your father? She looked up to find Alexander in the doorway, his suit slightly dusty from inspecting the construction work. These days, the powerful CEO spent as much time on construction sites and in community meetings as he did in boardrooms. He would have liked the man you've become, she said softly. Not because of the money or the ring, but because you learned to see people as more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Alexander crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, looking at the ledger. Show me how he did it, he said. How he made this place more than just a store. Olivia turned the pages, pointing to various entries. See these notes in the margins? When customers were struggling, he'd create special discounts just for them. He kept track of everyone's birthdays, their children's allergies, their favorite products. She smiled at a particular entry. Here, he gave Mrs. Rodriguez extra credit when her husband got sick, then marked it paid in full when she tried to repay him months later. That's the kind of business model we need to bring back, Alexander said thoughtfully. Not just here, but everywhere we can. Speaking of everywhere, Olivia pulled out her tablet, showing him the latest community center plans. The library board approved our expansion proposal. We can start the children's programming next month. Perfect timing, he grinned, because I have something to show you too. He led her outside where a small crowd had gathered. A construction worker was carefully mounting something above the store's entrance. As Olivia watched, he unveiled the new sign, Chen and Rhodes Community Market. Tears sprang to her eyes as she read it. Alexander, your father's legacy and our future, he said, holding her close. Together. The crowd burst into applause, led by Mrs. Than and the other neighborhood business owners. Someone started passing out cups of Greek wine, and the celebration quickly turned into an impromptu street party. I have one more surprise, Alexander whispered in her ear as they watched the community celebrate. The board didn't just approve the local business protection fund. They want to make it a model for all our future developments. They're calling it the Chen Initiative. Olivia turned to face him, stunned. What? Every new roads enterprises development will now include provisions for protecting and supporting local businesses. Affordable commercial spaces, mentorship programs, community integration requirements. Everything we're doing here, but on a national scale. She thought about all the other families like hers, all the other dreams that could be saved rather than crushed. You're really changing things, she said wonderingly. We're changing things, he corrected. Your father's principles, your understanding of community, my business experience. It's all coming together to create something neither of us could have done alone. As if to emphasize his point, a group of children from her library program ran up, eager to show them the welcome signs they'd made for the market's upcoming grand opening. Each drawing featured books, food, and people of all sizes and colors coming together. Miss Chen, one little girl tugged at her sleeve. Will you still read to us when you're married? Of course, Olivia laughed. In fact, we'll have even more stories to share. And more storytellers, Alexander added, winking at the children. I've been practicing. The celebration continued into the evening, with neighbors bringing food, sharing stories, and offering wedding suggestions. James and Sophie arrived with champagne and news that the first Small Business Protection Fund grants were ready to be distributed. As Olivia watched Alexander discuss expansion plans with a group of local entrepreneurs, she felt a deep sense of rightness. This was justice, not the vengeful kind she'd originally planned, but something more powerful, the justice of transformation, of growth, of love, changing not just two people, but an entire community. What neither of them noticed was the elderly man watching from across the street, tears in his eyes as he photographed the scene with a shaking hand. Mr. Chen had chosen this moment to return, drawn by Sophie's careful updates about his daughter's journey. But seeing the joy in Olivia's face, the pride in the community's celebration, and the genuine change in the man who had once been his adversary, he decided to wait just a little longer before making his presence known. Some homecomings, he knew, needed the perfect moment, and that moment was coming soon. The morning of Chen's market grand opening dawned bright and clear. Olivia stood in front of the mirror in what would soon be her apartment above the store, adjusting her dress nervously. The space had been renovated, but maintained its original charm, with her father's old furniture carefully restored and integrated with modern pieces. Everything's ready downstairs, Alexander announced, entering the bedroom. He stopped short when he saw her. You look beautiful. She smoothed down the traditional Chinese qipao she'd chosen for the occasion, red silk with golden phoenixes. It was my mother's, she explained. Dad gave it to Sophie for safekeeping when we lost the store. I thought it would be right to wear it today. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, both of them looking at their reflection. Your father would be proud of everything you've built. Everything we've built, she corrected, then frowned slightly. I just wish... A knock at the door interrupted her thought. It was Sophie, looking unusually excited. You need to come downstairs right now. Both of you. The street outside had been transformed. Colorful banners stretched between buildings. Tables laden with food from every neighborhood restaurant lined the sidewalks, and it seemed the entire community had turned out for the celebration. But something was different from their rehearsed plans. There was an energy in the crowd, a buzz of anticipation. The crowd parted as they descended the stairs, and Olivia stopped breathing. There, standing in front of the store's entrance, was her father. Mr. Chen looked older, more weathered than in her memories, but his eyes held the same warmth she remembered. He stood straight and proud, dressed in his best suit, the one he'd worn on the original opening day of Chen's market. Dad, Olivia whispered, her legs suddenly unsteady. Alexander's arm around her waist kept her upright. Little one, Mr. Chen said softly, using his old nickname for her. I hope I'm not too late for the opening. Olivia broke away from Alexander and ran to her father, throwing herself into his arms like she was a child again. The crowd around them burst into applause, many wiping away tears. How? When? She couldn't form complete sentences through her tears. I've been following your journey, Mr. Chen explained, holding her tight. Sophie kept me updated. I've been in California, working with your uncle, healing, waiting for the right moment to return. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. When I heard about the Chen initiative, about everything you and Alexander were doing, I knew it was time. At the mention of Alexander's name, Olivia turned to look at her fiancé, who stood uncertainly at a distance. To her surprise, her father released her and walked toward him. Mr. Chen, Alexander began, I know I can never fully make up for. The past is past, Mr. Chen interrupted, his voice firm but kind. What matters is what we build for the future. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, worn key. This was to the original store. I think it belongs to both of you now. Alexander looked at the key, then at Olivia, his eyes shining with tears. We would be honored if you would help us run it, Mr. Chen. Your experience, your wisdom, we need them both. Mr. Chen smiled, the same warm smile Olivia remembered from her childhood. Please call me Dad. I hear that's what I'll be to you soon anyway. The gathering turned into something more than just a store opening. It became a homecoming celebration. Mrs. Than produced special dishes she remembered Mr. Chen loving. The Greek taverna owner broke out his finest ouzo, and children from Olivia's literacy program presented her father with hand-drawn welcome cards. As the day progressed, Olivia found herself watching her father and Alexander deep in conversation, pointing at various features of the store, discussing plans and improvements. The sight of them together, building something new from the ashes of the past, filled her heart, almost to bursting. Your mother would have loved this, her father said later, as they sat together in the reading corner. She always said that true success wasn't in what you owned, but in what you built for others. Is that why you came back? Olivia asked softly. I came back because I saw my daughter and her chosen partner turning pain into purpose. He squeezed her hand. And because some stories deserve happy endings. From across the room, Alexander caught her eye and smiled. That special smile that was just for her. Around them, the community celebrated not just the opening of a store, but the healing of old wounds and the promise of new beginnings. As evening approached, Mr. Chen stood to address the crowd. Years ago, I thought losing this store was the end of our family's story, he said, his voice strong and clear. Today, I see it was just the beginning of a bigger one. Chen's Market was always more than just a store. It was a dream of bringing people together. Today, that dream lives again, bigger and better than ever. He raised his glass, looking at his daughter and future son-in-law. To Chen and Rhodes, may they build bridges where others see walls, and may they always remember that the greatest profit comes from investing in people. The toast was echoed by the crowd, but Olivia barely heard them. She was too busy watching her past and future merge into a present more perfect than any revenge could have created. The weeks leading up to the wedding transformed the neighborhood into a bustling celebration of cultures and community. Rather than choosing an exclusive venue, Olivia and Alexander had decided to hold their ceremony in the street between Chen's Market and the library, the two places that had brought them together. Are you sure you don't want something more elaborate? Alexander's mother asked during a wedding planning session in the market's community room. She was still adjusting to this new version of her son, the one who preferred neighborhood gatherings to charity galas. This is elaborate, Olivia responded, showing her the plans. Look, Mrs. Than is coordinating the Vietnamese dishes, Mr. Stavros is handling Mediterranean cuisine. The local florists are working together on the decorations, and the children from our literacy program are preparing a special. And the whole neighborhood is involved, Alexander, his arm around Olivia's. That's more meaningful than any five-star wedding planner could create. His mother's expression softened as she watched them together. The change in her son was undeniable. Gone was the cold, calculating businessman, replaced by someone who looked genuinely happy, engaged with life and community in a way she'd never seen before. In the store below, Mr. Chen was teaching a group of young entrepreneurs about sustainable business practices, something that had become a regular feature at Chen's Market. The store had evolved into more than just a market. It was now a hub for community education, bringing together experienced business owners and those just starting out. The first rule of good business, they could hear him saying, is to remember that every transaction is about people, not just profit. Your father's lessons are spreading, Alexander murmured to Olivia. The Chen initiative has already helped preserve 30 small businesses across our development sites. And transformed Rhodes Enterprises' reputation, Olivia added. I saw the article in the Business Journal. From corporate raider to community builder, the revolutionary approach of Alexander Rhodes. Alexander chuckled. If they only knew it all started with a bet and a plan for revenge. Life has a funny way of turning our worst intentions into our best outcomes, Olivia's father said, joining them upstairs. He was carrying a dusty old book. Found this while organizing the storeroom. Your mother's recipe book, little one. I thought you might want to include some of these dishes in the wedding feast. Olivia took the book reverently, her fingers tracing the handwritten notes in the margins. Her mother had passed when Olivia was young, but her warmth and wisdom lived on in these pages. Look, she showed Alexander a page, her mooncake recipe. She used to say that sharing food was like sharing love. It brings people together and makes them family. Then we'll make sure every recipe in this book is represented at our wedding, Alexander declared. Each dish can tell part of our story. The planning continued, but it was unlike any traditional wedding preparation. Instead of seating charts, they created community gathering spaces. Rather than a gift registry, they established a neighborhood improvement fund. The wedding favors would be books for children and seed money for aspiring entrepreneurs. One evening, as they walked through the neighborhood checking on preparations, they passed the spot where they'd had their first conversation about the literacy program. Alexander stopped suddenly. What is it? Olivia asked. I was just thinking about that first day, he said. How certain I was that I knew everything about success and value. How wrong I was. She squeezed his hand. We both had a lot to learn. And we're still learning, he smiled. The board approved the expansion of the Chen initiative yesterday. We're taking it national. Every major city where we have developments will have a community integration program based on what we've built here. Dad will be pleased, Olivia said. He's already talking about training other retired business owners to become mentors. They continued their walk, greeting neighbors who were hanging lanterns and string lights for the upcoming celebration. Children ran past them, practicing their roles for the wedding ceremony. Each would carry a book that had special meaning to the couple. At the library, they found Sophie organizing a display of photographs chronicling the neighborhood's transformation. The before and after pictures told a powerful story. Closed shops reopening, empty streets filling with life, communities coming together. Who would have thought, Sophie mused, that what started as a scheme for revenge would end up healing not just two people, but an entire community. And beyond, Alexander added. Every day we're proving that business can be both profitable and compassionate. As they stood there, surrounded by the evidence of positive change, Olivia felt a profound sense of rightness. Their wedding wouldn't just be a celebration of their love. It would be a testament to the power of transformation, redemption, and the strength of community bonds. One more week, she whispered to Alexander. Until forever begins, he replied, pulling her close. What they didn't know was that the community had a surprise in store for their special day, one that would bring their story full circle in the most unexpected and touching way. The wedding day dawned with a perfect mix of sunshine and gentle breeze, as if nature itself was celebrating with them. The street between Chen's Market and the library had been transformed into an enchanted space, with paper lanterns, fairy lights, and flowers creating a canopy overhead. Chairs were arranged in a circle rather than traditional rows, symbolizing the community's interconnectedness. Olivia stood in her old bedroom above the store, now beautifully restored, as Sophie helped her with the final touches of her wedding dress. A stunning fusion of Western and Chinese designs that represented both her heritage and her future. Her father knocked softly before entering, his eyes glistening when he saw her. You look just like your mother, he said softly, touching the delicate silk. She would have loved to see this day. She's here, Olivia replied, touching the jade pendant that had been her mother's. In every recipe being prepared downstairs, in every detail we planned, in every smile today. Meanwhile, in the library's reading room, Alexander adjusted his bow tie, surrounded by the books that had first brought him into Olivia's world. James stood nearby, holding a small package. "The original bet contract," James explained, handing it to Alexander. "I thought you might want to do the honors." Alexander opened the package and looked at the document that had started everything. Without hesitation, he tore it into pieces and dropped them into a beautiful handmade box, decorated by the children from the literacy program. "Something old destroyed, something new created," he said with a smile. The ceremony began with a surprise. As Olivia prepared to walk down the aisle, she found not just her father waiting to escort her, but a line of community members, each holding a book that had meaning in their story. Mrs. Than held The Little Prince, which Olivia had been reading the day they met. Mr. Stavros carried a book about small business success that Alexander had studied while learning to change his corporate approach. The children from their literacy program walked ahead, sprinkling flower petals and carrying copies of their favorite stories. Each book represented a chapter in Olivia and Alexander's journey from enemies to soulmates. When Olivia reached the circle's center, where Alexander waited, the community had another surprise. Instead of a traditional wedding ceremony, they had prepared readings from various cultural traditions about love, transformation, and community. Each reading was delivered in a different language, then translated, creating a tapestry of voices and wisdom. Mr. Chen stepped forward to deliver his blessing, but instead of speaking alone, he invited all the local business owners to join him. Together, they shared how Olivia and Alexander's story had sparked a revolution of compassionate business practices that was spreading beyond their neighborhood. "Today, Mr. Chen concluded, we celebrate not just the union of two people, but the proof that love can transform not only hearts, but entire communities. My daughter sought justice and found love. Alexander sought a bet and found purpose. Together, they've shown us that the greatest profit comes from investing in people." As they exchanged vows, Olivia and Alexander added their own surprise. Instead of traditional promises, they shared their vision for the future. Plans for expanding the Chen initiative nationwide, creating more community centers, and ensuring that their love story would continue to inspire positive change. "I promise," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "to never forget that true wealth lies in the strength of our communities and the love we share. You taught me that, Olivia, and I'll spend my life helping others learn it too." "And I promise," Olivia responded, tears shining in her eyes, "to always remember that revenge may be sweet, but redemption is sweeter." Our story proves that love can heal not just hearts, but entire neighborhoods. The celebration that followed was unlike any wedding reception the city had seen. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes from every culture represented in their community. Children performed readings from their favorite books. Local musicians played everything from traditional Chinese melodies to Greek dance tunes. As evening fell, paper lanterns glowed overhead, and the couple shared their first dance in the street where their story had begun. Around them, the community celebrated not just their love, but the transformation it had inspired. "Look," Alexander whispered, gesturing to where his corporate board members were chatting animatedly with local shop owners, exchanging ideas and contact information. "Worlds colliding in the best way possible." Olivia smiled, watching her father teach Alexander's mother the proper way to fold dumplings at one of the food stations. "Not colliding," she corrected. "Merging, growing, building something new together." The night's final surprise came when the children from their literacy program presented them with a handmade book titled The Story of Us, filled with drawings and words describing how Olivia and Alexander's love had changed their neighborhood. As they flipped through the pages together, they reached the last one, which simply read, "And they proved that the best stories don't end with happily ever after. They end with, and they built happiness for everyone." Looking around at their transformed community, at the joy on every face, at the bridges built between different worlds, Olivia and Alexander knew the children had gotten it. Exactly right. Their story wasn't just about two people finding love. It was about a whole community, discovering that when hearts open to change, anything is possible. And as they danced under the stars, surrounded by the family they'd been born with and the family they'd built, they knew that this wasn't an ending at all. It was simply the beginning of their greatest chapter yet.